Let me start by welcoming everyone back to VDEV CEPR and BREAD seminar series. Some of you might be repeat participants, some others might be new. Today we have Karthik, who's going to talk about general equilibrium effects of improving public employment programs, experimental evidence from India. We're really happy to have Karthik here, and also Paul and Sandip are going to be in the webinar for a little while, not very long, but they're going to be around for a little while. As you know, the house rules are, this is a very nice environment. Let's try not to ruin this. Please type your questions in the Q&A section. Paul and Sandip will try to reply to that. And if possible, when we have the time, I'll try to convey the questions that are possible to Karthik directly. This is going to go on for the first 1 hour, and then the last 15 minutes, you just raise your virtual hand. You'll be allowed to ask your questions directly to Karthik. I'm guessing this is basically it. Oh, Karthik is also generously offered to be in his own Zoom room after the webinar, and so we'll share that link as well. And so you'll be able to talk to Karthik directly for 45 minutes, I think, just after the seminar. So without further ado, I guess, Karthik, I guess it's a good time for you to potentially share your slide. And
perfect.
Take it away.
Great. Can you see those slides now?
Yep.
All right.
You might want to make them full screen. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So thank you so much to the organizers for creating this wonderful global forum to be able to bring a standard development seminar to just to the whole world. So this is joint work with Paul and Sandip. We've been working on this for a very long time. It's a long paper. There's a lot going on, but I will try to cover as much as I can. Okay. So what's this paper about? The paper is, if you look at public employment programs in developing countries, where the government basically provides employment on public projects, are among the most common forms of anti-poverty programs in developing countries. So there's a very long history. So in 18th century India, if you go to Lucknow, you will see this big mosque there called the Bada Imambada, which was in fact constructed by the king of that time, essentially as a drought relief program. And in the US, the Depression era, the Works Projects Administration, more recently employment guarantee schemes starting in Maharashtra in the 80s, modern programs in India. There's now programs in many parts of Africa. And, and India, of course, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is the largest such program in the world, reaching over 600 million adults. So there's various policy rationales for programs like this. The first is just self-targeting through work requirements. And so if you can't target people through administrative data, then this becomes a very attractive feature. There's the idea that you're going to create public assets and not just give out people money. There's the idea that in settings of high informality, that this becomes an effective way of imposing a wage floor because the government's not able to implement minimum wages. And I think the political rationale is also really important, that at a very kind of gut level, it's much more palatable to taxpayers to be funding employment-based anti-poverty programs rather than just a dole. Okay, so I think this has been around and it's a big deal, but despite its importance, there's still some really key open questions on the impacts of these programs on aggregate incomes and poverty and welfare. And I think the fundamental problem is that, and as economists, we all understand this, is that if all you cared about was estimating the effect of the program income, then you could survey people and ask them, have you worked on NREGS? How many days of work? How much money have you gotten? And you would be done, okay? The problem is we all believe that there's good reasons to think, and we've seen this in the existing work as well, that a program like this can affect the broader labor market. So it could actually make the poverty, the income effects even stronger if you're able to also push up market wages. Alternatively, it could attenuate the benefits because if you're increasing wages without increasing productivity, if private employment is going to fall, then that could actually reduce some of the effects of NREGA. Okay, so we both care about this overall effect and about the relative contributions of the direct effect of the program and the indirect market channels of the total impact. Okay, and this is just a really hard question to get at. and for reasons I'll just talk about. Okay, so and then there's questions about impacts on labor markets, on wages and employment, and then on mechanisms. So if you're getting these impacts, and NREGS can do multiple things, it can boost productivity directly by building rural assets, or maybe by making people more nourished. There's this direct labor market competition with the private sector and the market structure, which I'll spend a lot of time talking about. And then there's potential aggregate demand channels. So there's a lot of things going on with when you have a large scale intervention like this. So what makes this kind of difficult is it's not, given the importance of NREGA, I mean, there's literally hundreds of papers in NREGS, right? So it's not like people haven't worked on this, I think. But what's kind of vexing about the literature is that the results are kind of all over the place, right? I mean, so you have perfectly sensible papers that show that wages increased and others that find that it stayed flat. You have increase in violence in some papers, reduction in others. You have education improving in some, worsening in others, or mixed. And the reason is each of these papers are actually perfectly well done. The problem is that it depends on what method you're using. Okay, so the program was rolled out across districts in India. So there's a bunch of papers that use a difference in difference, but the problem there is the parallel trends are not fully satisfied till you control for a bunch of other things. And then there's others that use a regression discontinuity around program eligibility. And the problem there is you often don't have enough bandwidth or enough sample in an adequate bandwidth to give you power. Okay. And then it's also confounded by limitations of data, because the time when the NREGS was rolled out, you didn't have a thick round of the NSS. So that's just limited the outcome data that's available. I think the deeper problem is what we call construct validity, right? Which is that it is well known that NREGA implementation quality varied widely across states, right? I mean, so even Imbert and Papp, which is one of the best known papers in this literature, they restrict their analysis to what they call the star states, which were states that implemented well. Okay, so the problem is that you observe the top line of the program budgets, but you don't observe the bottom line of what is actually happening on the ground. And so without observing that, if you see variation in studies, you don't know how much of this is because of variation in implementation, which is a very different interpretation from saying NREGA had this effect or that effect, right? And then there's other identification challenges. So if the program like this is going to affect labor markets, there's no reason to expect that effects are going to be confined within geographic boundaries. Okay, so there is some evidence to suggest that the existing district level estimates may be biased. So Murfeld has a paper using REDS data that has the geocoded data, but that sample is quite small. So the problem is you need data that's more granular than the identifying variation. So you might vary the program at a district level, but if you're observing outcomes at the district level, then you can't get at spatial spillovers. And then there's this last issue of data, and we'll talk about the data limitations and how that I think may have some bearing on how we think about what we've learned so far. Okay, so what is this paper trying to do? What we're trying to do is we're trying to address these challenges by combining first exogenous experimental variation. Okay, so we worked with the government of Andhra Pradesh. This is the undivided Andhra Pradesh. This is in 2010 to 2012 to randomize the rollout of a new technology to improve NREGA implementation. So this was this biometric smart card program, and the project was initially designed to study the impacts of biometric smart cards on corruption and program implementation in NREGA, right? So, and that paper is already done and published. And so that was what the experiment was designed for. And what you found is that this was incredibly effective at improving NREGA implementation. So it made the payment process faster, it made it more reliable, there was lower leakage and corruption, there was more access to work, and there was more NREGS participation and much greater user satisfaction, right? So in almost every metric, the smart cards brought the program closer to what the program designers intended it to do. And interestingly, there was no change in the fiscal outlay of the program, okay? And so this paper is kind of a downstream paper from that original experiment, and in some ways was not even planned. And I'll talk about kind of some of those places where that matters. But basically what we have is that the smart cards is kind of a first stage for improving NREGA. And this is then the downstream effect of what happens when NREGA becomes more effectively implemented. And then you have a unit of randomization that's large enough to generate GE effect. So this is randomized at the level of entire sub-districts of about 65,000 people each. But the villages in our survey data are geocoded, which allows us to then quantify, because there's going to be variation based on your distance to the border and the random variation in your neighbors about how much spillovers, how much spatial exposure you had. And we have much more detailed data on outcomes. So So the survey data, so the NSS doesn't measure income, which is a big limitation, right? So we have data on income by source, on agriculture, non-agriculture, on NREGA, labor income. We have data on wages, and importantly on reservation wages, which is going to be important to pin down shifts in labor supply and labor demand. So far we only observe market wages in most existing work, and then we have employment, where the NSS again has this problem that it doesn't distinguish between self and private employment. So we have both NREGA employment, we have self-employment, and we have private employment. And that's going to be a really important distinction. And then what we did was, because the survey is limited to the universe of people who worked on NREGA or eligible for NREGA, that's 50% of the population, we then supplement this with multiple sources of census data sets, including the SCCC for income and the economic census for enterprises and employment, and also for livestock. So I think the first thing to caveat at the very beginning is, how do you interpret a paper like this? Because evaluating the impact of improvement is obviously different from the impact of the program rollout itself, okay? But in many ways, they're very, very similar, right? Because what matters from a program perspective is how much effective NREGA you have on the ground, okay? And that effective NREGA increases both when you roll out the program and also when implementation quality is improved, right? So in some ways, there's like a continuum from zero, there's like no program and no implementation. And then you go further down to say there's a program with weak implementation, and then there's a program with much stronger implementation. So it may be tempting to think about this in an IV framework, where your endogenous variable is effective NREGA that you're instrumenting for, but that doesn't quite work because it's not a unidimensional metric. And we'll come back and talk about how, if you wanted a summary statistic to capture the extent of effective NREGA, maybe because it depends on so many things, right? So the best summary statistic might actually be the reservation wage that people report for working in the private sector, okay? But I think the deeper point here is that the existing literature also understands the centrality of implementation quality, right? So the important PAP paper will look at only the star states because that's where the program got well implemented. So the way to think about the paper is the magnitudes of the effects may not be strictly comparable to prior work, right? Because it is studying a different reform, but the direction of the results will speak to the same underlying question of interest, because what you've done is you've increased how much effective NREGA there is on the ground. And then the two caveats, that come from the nature of the survey data, right? Because again, the survey data is representative of the universe of people registered for NREGA. So these are people with job cards, and that's about 50% of the rural population. So the survey is sampled from that universe, but it doesn't sample those without the job card. So the most detailed data we have is going to be on the job card universe. And frankly, that's the population we care about the most, right? Because that's the population the program was designed to help. And the concern about offsetting impacts from reduced private sector employment would also apply mainly to that population, okay? But then we are going to supplement this with census data, and that's why this paper has taken so much time, because once we looked at the survey data, saw these results, then we kept kind of looking for other data sets to confirm what we were finding. And then the other limitation is that partly because of recall and partly because of when NREGA work peaks, right? The surveys are done in July, August, and the wage and employment data are for the month of June, okay? So we don't have kind of an annual time series of wage and employment, and that's going to be one other limitation in the paper. But basically what you'll see is that with all these additional data sets, no individual data set is comprehensive, but across the union of them, it paints a pretty consistent picture of what's going on, okay? So what do we find? And so there's 3 slides of results, okay? So, and first I'm just going to talk about the survey data. What do we see in the survey data? And the first result is that we find this striking increase in household income, nearly 14% increase in household income, and a 26% reduction in poverty. Now, this is an income-based threshold of poverty because we're measuring income, whereas normally we measure this by consumption. So, but with that caveat, this is a 26% reduction in poverty. Now, I think the first, that number is big, okay? But the second kind of really aha moment for us was seeing that these income gains are primarily happening not because of NREGA, right? That the non-NREGS earnings account for 86% of this income gain, and the NREGA itself is only about 14%. And out of that 86% of non-NREGA gains, like the 80% of that is coming from market labor income, okay? So this is what people are earning for their labor, but outside the NREGA. So how are these kind of market earnings going up so much? Right. The first thing is that we see that market wages rose, and they rose substantially, right? They rose by 10% in June. And what you see is that the spillovers also kind of really matter here. So I'll come back and talk more extensively about the technical issues with the spillovers. But the bottom line is that when you put the spillovers, you're going to get, the estimates get more unbiased when you account for the spillovers, but you lose precision because you're estimating another parameter. Okay, so the spillover effects are not always going to be significant for all the results, but directionally, they always go in the direction of the main effect. Okay, and so that gives us a lot of confidence that what we're picking up in the main effect is real, because essentially the spillover is saying that the main effect you get when it's a 0-1, the spillover, my spatial exposure might be 0.2 or 0.3, so it's going to be like correspondingly smaller and not always powered, but the direction is always going to be in the same direction as the main effect. But here, in fact, the spillovers are significant, okay? And you see that if you ignore the spillovers, you would understate the effect by about 1/3, okay? So there's a direct effect and indirect effect. And then I think the most surprising and kind of stunning result for us was the fact that even though market wages went up, what you see is an increase in private employment. Okay, so private employment goes up significantly by 18%. Now, this is off a low base, okay, because this is the month of June where private employment is only 8 days in the month. So about 17 odd days there's a lot of self-employment, low marginal productivity, self-employment, or not working. And so you see the significant increase in private employment and reduction in self-employment. And again, the main and the spillover effects are in the same direction. The migration results are kind of mixed, like, some positive, some negative. And so, because there's two countervailing forces here with, you may reduce short-term distress migration, but increase long-term migration by providing the income needed for the search costs, as we've seen in work from Mushfiq and Sambazi and others, okay? There's no change in prices, okay? So these wages and income gains are real gains. And so that must mean that these wage increases, if they were real, were being passed on to the employers. So this is, again, something we didn't have in earlier versions of the paper because we don't have the data on the big landlords, okay? But even in the NREGA job card sample of 50%, a lot of people do own land, even in that sample. So we can look at the returns to land in our survey sample, and what you see is kind of consistent with this increase in real wages. You see a significant reduction in net farm earnings, and landowners also report a reduction in the valuation of their land by about 6%. So that's not significant. The first one is, but directionally, all of this points towards that this was redistributing, the returns to labor went up and the returns to land went down. Okay, so that's in the survey data. So then what we do is the two most important results here are the income and the employment. And we got very lucky that there happened to be, independent of us at the same time, two big censuses going on. So the first is the SocioeconomicCast census that was done in 2011-12, and our experiment was mid-2010 to mid-2012. So it was at the perfect time for us. And what we find in this independent census is, again, a significant reduction in poverty in treated areas. Now, one limitation of the SEC is that it has only ordinal categories of income, so you can't kind of quantify this. It just says, are you a household where the highest earner earns below 5,000, between 5 and 10,000 above? So it's ordinal, but it's consistent in that you see these significant reductions in poverty. And then the other thing which we got lucky about was the government of India also has an economic census every 5 years. Okay, so and this was conducted in 2012-13, about a year after the experiment. And what we see is that there's a significant increase in the number of non-agricultural establishments and a substantial increase in employment in these establishments. Okay, so, and this is a big number. So there's this 34% increase. In fact, it's bigger actually after adjusting for spillovers, and that 11% of the this is 11% of the working age population. Okay, so compared with about 8% in the entire preceding decade. So between 2000 and 2010, the fraction of the working age population that moved from agriculture to non-agriculture was about 8%, and here you're getting more than that in about 2.5 years. Okay, so, and what this suggests, and we're going to come back to that, is kind of the role of a coordinated increase in wages, perhaps in shifting, in accelerating a structural transformation. But you see these results in the census. Now, the other thing we've been able to do in the last kind of year, which we had not thought about before, is that we don't observe the big landlords in the survey data, okay? But you can characterize the distribution effects by taking the treatment effects from the survey and then applying that to the factor endowments that you get in the census, okay? So basically you see in the survey that the returns to labor went up, wages went up, the returns to land fell down. The SECC gives you every household by land holding, right? So you have a census of households by land holding, and that also gives you household composition, so you know who are the working age adults in the house. Okay, and so that allows you to basically impute for households at every percentile of the landholding distribution what would be the expected wage gain and what would be the expected profit loss. Okay, and so when you add those two together, what you see is that the net incomes increased for the bottom 92 or 93% of households by land holding, and it only fell for the really large landowners holding over 7 acres of land. And in fact, if you order the households by SES as opposed to land holdings, we estimate that the positive effects are positive at every part of the distribution, right? Because land by construction is going to maximize your chances of the big landholders being worse off, but SES also has other components. And so then, it's not as stark in terms of the loss at the high end. And then finally, just in terms of comparing with other studies, right? Because, we have a whole section in the paper on this, but like I said, how do you interpret this in light of the existing literature? And in many ways, they're consistent with Imbert and Papp, right? Because you get this increase in wages, and they also have this characterization of the distribution of the effects, and that looks very similar. The big difference is in employment, okay? And so they report this kind of negative effect, which is small with an elasticity of minus 0.38, but that's almost certainly driven by how the NSS measures it, right? Because the NSS does not separate self-employment and market employment, and that pools it together. And if you look at our data, we can separate that, and you see there is in fact a significant fall in the self-employment, right? But there's this increase in market employment. And we know that the self-employment here is likely to be low marginal product. And in fact, Imbert and Papp say that in their paper themselves. And so I think it also highlights that it's not just identification, it's also measurement, right? Which changes how we think about this. And the other thing is NSS doesn't measure income, and so existing work mechanically has to infer income results by multiplying wages and employment, whereas we measure income directly and can triangulate, right, that the income results line up with the wage and the employment results. So how do we make sense of all of this? Okay, because I think, when we saw these results first time 7 years ago, we're like, these just look too big. Okay, it kind of reversed a lot of our priors, because the default prior of most economists, including us, was that, hey, you increase wages without productivity, this is going to push down employment. Okay, so mechanisms wise, the key question is, how could wages and employment go up together at the same time? And that's what we focus on. And so in the paper, we have a full theoretical model in the appendix with kind of just a production function, a labor supply, a labor supply schedule that is affected by the quality of the outside option, which in this case will be NREGA. And then, we look at labor demand under different market structures. Okay, but based on that, the first kind of hypothesis is, which is what we even thought in 2015, 2016, is that maybe you're just getting more rural assets, and multiple people thought this, right? And because if you have less corruption in NREGA, you're implementing more NREGA, that you would get more physical capital, right? And so if that's productivity enhancing physical capital, maybe that can explain what's going on. But basically, we push this really, really hard, and it doesn't seem that this can explain much of the effects. So in the production function, if you kind of look at the amount of capital increase that it would take to explain the results we find, and with very generous assumptions, the capital stock can only be about 2.5% of the total effects we find. So similarly, it's not likely to be a nutrition-based efficiency and wage story that people get more income from NREGA, they eat more, because we have this question in the survey data about, have you eaten 3 square meals? And I think 97% answer yes for every day in the past month. Okay, so this is already not like a destitute place. This is not a place where that seems to bind. And same with skills, because the job here is fundamentally unskilled. And one way to kind of confirm this is that, we have census data, we have government's administrative data on land use, on area under cultivation, on area irrigated, and we're not seeing any impact on that, which would be, and you would expect some effect there if this was coming through asset creation. But also in our own data, the model will show you that land profits should be weakly increasing in productivity. And the fact that the profits are negative tells you that productivity per se is going to be second order to the overall story. Okay, now, but what is going on is that we find really kind of compelling evidence of monopsony and imperfect market competition. Okay, so and so, like I said, we not only observe market wages, but we have this question on reservation wages, which is quite nice about this particular survey. And so that allows us to pin down and say that, listen, the outside option improved here, and so there was the shift in labor supply because the reservation wage went up by about 7%. And then what you can do is, because with the SECC data, you have every land holding in the village. You can construct an index of land market concentration, and then you can interact the treatment effect with that concentration. And what you see is that the level of employment is lower in areas with more concentration, and the interaction with the treatment is significantly positive, right? So that's kind of exactly the sharp test of monopsony you would have, because basically in perfectly competitive markets, if the wage went up, then employment should go down, right? And here you see exactly the opposite. Now, that test is not the same test as quantifying the markdown. So then we take this to the model, and you kind of have a simple formula for the markdown between wages relative to marginal product, and then we estimate that with our with the model and the moments on reservation wages and market wages, and we estimate that this markdown is going to be about an upper bound of 25%. Okay, so workers are getting paid at least 75% of their marginal product, and so this 25% markdown is in line with global estimates of employee market power, but it's on the higher end of market power, right? And so suggests that employers do have considerable market power in the setting. And then the last story here is, so yes, so they got more income, but then what did they do with this, right? So what did they do with the income? So the paper is not about Engel curves, right? So we're not really prioritizing measuring consumption, but we have very good measures in savings, okay? And so what you see is that only 3% of this increased income is saved. And so what that suggests is that that the bulk of this extra earnings is going to come back into the economy, either through consumption or through the purchase of assets. Okay, so we see an increase in borrowing and asset holdings. And we also see that half the labor income that we calculate is coming from non-agricultural labor, right? Suggesting that labor demand in the non-agricultural sector did go up. We've already seen the evidence of the increase in non-ag firms and non-ag employment. And then if you look at the firm size distribution of where these firms are being created, most of these are single employee firms. And so again, that suggests that if you're so small, you depend a lot on local demand and you're not producing for tradable goods for integrated markets. And so again, that's all consistent with this pretty substantial aggregate demand kind of feedback loop. Okay, so putting this together in mechanisms, it looks like direct increases in productivity were likely second order, but we do see kind of pretty compelling evidence of market power and aggregate demand. And again, these are not meant to be mutually exclusive. There could still be other things going on, but we're focusing on the three most likely proximate stories for why wages and employment could have gone up at the same time. Okay, so I'll take a pause after the slide, but I thought let me just quickly place the contributions in the broader literature, right? Because there's a lot of connections here. So I think the first is just obviously from a program evaluation perspective, right, we just care about the impacts of public works programs in developing countries. So the advances over the existing literature are the experiment at scale, the ability to do the spillovers, the documentation of the first stage. And that's very important because, like I said, till now, you've only observed the top line of budget spending, but you don't know what's actually reaching, okay? So we can document that you can interpret these effects as a result of a meaningful change in every practical parameter of NREGA from the perspective of the beneficiaries. There's kind of better data on income and employment, measurement wages, on reservation wages, land concentration, and the key results on employment and income are validated in both the surveys and the censuses. We confirm some existing results like wages, but then the key new results is this large gain in increase and reduction in poverty, driven mainly by market earnings. And you get these positive effects on private employment, which is key for policy. And mechanisms, productivity looks unlikely, monopsony and aggregate demand looks like it is part of the story. Now, the other interesting thing is, even though this was a program evaluation, right, you can kind of learn about market structure from the results that you're getting, right, because the results are clearly not consistent with competitive rural labor markets, okay? So there is therefore indirect evidence here, and I think it's among the first to show this, right, of direct evidence of monopsony in rural labor markets in less developed countries. And this is consistent with other work on minimum wages. There's a paper in South Africa that kind of shows that increasing minimum wages need not reduce employment. There's a paper by Vidya Soundararajan in India showing how when minimum wages are better enforced, you actually get higher employment as well. So, you know, there is now emerging evidence from developing countries and around the world that labor markets are unlikely to be perfectly competitive. And so it's kind of building and contributing in that space. And I think even more generally, there's this much older theme in development economics, right, about the structural transformation with the big push that if you can coordinate on higher wages, that you can in fact that the effects of higher wages will, of better aggregate demand, higher demand will compensate for the negative effects of higher wages, and you can drive a structural transformation. So there's now a bunch of non-experimental work on this. Jeremy Magruder has a paper in Indonesia, Kyle Emmerich in India, Gabby Santangelo. So you are starting to see evidence that the positive effects of wages, higher wages in terms of aggregate demand, can outweigh the negative effects on employees. So the other kind of broader contribution here is the importance of credible public options. Okay, so one of the big debates in NREGA has been, and people like Sujit Bhalla have written about this for over 10 years, and saying, he would say, how can a little tail wag this big dog? Because if you look at the employment share, that NREGA is only 4% of rural employment on an all India basis aggregated over time. Okay, so how can this 4% like possibly have big market effects? Okay, so, and now, theoretically, we've known that what matters is not the market share, but the credibility as an outside option. Okay, so the credible outside option just changes how you negotiate, even if the market, even if in the equilibrium path you don't use it that much, it changes what you can negotiate, right? So theoretically, this has been known, but empirically, it's been hard to pin down because you haven't had data on the reservation wage. Okay, so I think there's a broader contribution here about how public options and public policies affect private markets, and it's like Archimedes, right? Give me a lever. So a small lever can, in fact, wag this very big dog. And there's this, you see evidence now in other contexts. There's this econometrica paper in Canada by Paul Boudry and others showing how, when you have a change in kind of industry composition, that the overall wage effects in that area are much larger than what would mechanically be explained by just the factor share of this new employer, suggesting there's a rippling through of these bargaining effects, right? So that's a Bartek type identification. And then there's Clemens and Gottlieb with Medicare in the US showing that even though Medicare is only 30% of the market, Medicare pricing kind of almost one-for-one affects how the private sector moves. Okay, so the public option really matters, even if the market share is not that big. In fact, recently at the BREAD MBR, Jishnu and Tahir and Asim and Natalie Bao presented this paper on how their intervention in Pakistan to improve public schools end up having this big spillover effect on private schools because they were forced to compete. Okay, so I think we're starting to see a growing body of evidence on these market effects that come from public interventions. I think the other broader general point here is that GE effects in program evaluation can be really first order, right? So Duron's written about this, others have written about this. But I think the key insight here is if we had randomized this evaluation at the level of the individual worker, we would have completely missed the plot, right? I mean, because if 90% of these effects are coming from market effects, then within the same market, if I'm comparing treatment and control at the individual level, then it's going to miss all of these aggregate effects. And so the good news is at scale experiments can capture this. And, we've been doing some, Ben and Rima have been doing some, Mushfiq's now doing some. So you're starting to see more of these experiments at scale to try and net these effects. And then going back to kind of a broader state capacity agenda, which I've been working on for a long time, it just kind of highlights the striking importance of implementation quality, right? So Paul and Sandip have this prior paper on showing how increasing the official NREGA wage had zero pass-through to the workers, right? Because essentially the binding constraint was implementation. But here you improve implementation, you didn't change the fiscal outlay, and you got an impact on market wages that are as big as that of the program rollout itself, okay? So, and this is why I think implementation and state capacity shouldn't be an afterthought, like, but this agenda of kind of making bureaucracy and the state work better is like a first order agenda in development in and of itself because of these large downstream effects you see. And then there's, of course, like other classic themes in development economics, right? So it just highlights how there was this Twitter thread with Dina Pomeranz and others about what is development economics, what's different, right? And so one of the ways I think about this is like in public finance, we normally teach that there's this inevitable trade-off between redistribution and efficiency, right? Whereas a lot of classic development models are about the poverty traps, that how well designed and implemented social protection programs can improve both equity and efficiency, right? So, and that's kind of the classic Banerjee Ghatak Barga paper in Bengal. And this is kind of in that same spirit that you could both improve the incomes and outcomes for the poor and also improve aggregate economic efficiency. But it also speaks to the political economy of anti-poverty programs. So Shivan Anderson and Ashok Kotwal and Patrick have this very nice paper showing how local elites kind of actively thwart the implementation of anti-poverty programs. And this has been documented by many other NREGA scholars based on field work, that local elites really hated the program, right? And we see that in the data, right? So if you look at the distributional effects, right, the top 5-7% are worse off, but the positive effects are widespread. And so it speaks to kind of this distributional, and obviously those folks have much higher political power, right? And so it speaks directly to that literature. And then of course, spillovers, right? We've seen in Kramer Miguel, like this is the same thing on a much, much larger scale. So, I feel it's a paper that obviously is about this program that then connects to a whole bunch of classic topics and questions in development. And I've probably run out of half my time. So how am I on time, Giacomo? Let me pause here and see if there's questions you want me to answer, and then I'll jump right in.
You're actually out for your time. And Paul has been doing a great job at answering all the questions. So there were like a few qualifying questions, but Paul has been like on top of this. So I think in this case, it's actually worth for you to keep going.
Just go ahead.
And,
Okay.
but be mindful of time because, yeah, you are like
I have
half away too.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So basically, I'm going to skip a lot of this stuff, right? So NREGA is India's flagship social protection program. Broad coverage, about half the rural households have a job card. It guarantees about 100 days of rural employment, but in practice, the constraint is kind of implementation capacity, right? So you rarely hit that cap. Okay, there's known implementation issues. The smart cards were trying to reduce leakage and improve payments experience. So this is all in the prior paper. And so that's what this intervention was trying to do. We had this MOU with the government of Andhra Pradesh to randomize. So this was a part of a staggered rollout. So the main thing we did was we got them to stagger the rollout into kind of 3 waves of a treatment, a buffer that's non-study and control. And the reason we had that buffer is with the government, they're chomping at the bit to keep rolling it out. So we're saying, okay, like, here's the treatment, here's the control, and then you can go to the buffer when we're collecting data. But overall, here's kind of a picture of the map of unified Andhra. Now we have external validity because it's in 2 states of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, right? This is now 2 states. But you'll see from this map already how these spatial spillovers are going to play out. Okay, so the light blues are the control, the dark blues are the treatments. So here, for example, down here, you'll see that there's this control guy who just completely randomly happens to be surrounded by treatment guys, right? Whereas out here, you have control mandals, right? Mean that are surrounded by non-treated areas. And so that gives you a sense of how you're going to get this kind of orthogonal spatial variation in how much spillover exposure you have. Okay. So smart cards, this is all in the first paper. It substantially improved program implementation, and it made payments faster by 30%, less time consuming to collect, more predictable. The variance fell down to about a 40% reduction in leakage. So in every way, it really substantially improved NREGA, which is kind of why, I mean, to be honest, this paper was not a paper we had planned for, right? If we had thought there would be such a big first stage with these huge downstream effects, we may have surveyed landlords as well, right? Like, so the magnitudes of these effects were, stunningly big. And so now the only concern here is that what, in terms of the exclusion restriction, what else was the smart cards doing? Okay, so could the smart cards have had direct effects on the labor market outside NREGA? So there's basically 2 other possibilities. Okay, so the first is because remember, the smart card program is a precursor to Aadhaar. So this is not Aadhaar. So it's not linked to a unified database. It doesn't talk to outside databases. So the whole thing was done by the Department of Rural Development in AP to help improve implementation of pensions and NREGA. Okay. Now with pensions, we see an improvement there as well. But we think that that's going to be completely second order because the pensions are targeted to people who could not work. Okay, so they were over 65, elderly, disabled, widows. And basically what we found was the leakage there was much lower to begin with. And in our data, we see that there's no benefit at all to people who are not working, including the pension cut. Okay, so we're pretty confident that that's not what's going on. Now, the second possible story is there a general financial inclusion story, okay? Because the smart cards did create bank accounts into which money could go. But the bad news for the citizens and the good news for us was because the government, the Rural Development Department also wanted to make sure that the money was being paid in 14 days. And they were concerned that the banks would try to hold on to the balances as a float and not give the money to beneficiaries. So they actually put as one of the contractual stipulations that the banks have to pay out this money on time. And as a result of that, only 0.3% of the households reported any positive balances in these accounts, okay? And also these bank accounts were not connected to the core banking server, so you couldn't take this and use it anywhere else except your village with that one designated kind of business correspondent, okay? So those would be the 2 main threats to identification and interpretation, and we think both of those are completely second order. And so we feel confident of interpreting these results as mainly driven by the effects of improving NREGA implementation. Okay, so the fund flow doesn't change, like I talked about. Okay. So let's get to the results. So the data, we've got the SCCC, we've got our own survey, we've got censuses. So I'm going to skip this. Let me spend some time here on the estimating equation. Okay, so basically these outcomes are indexed at the level of village, household, panchayat, and and mandal. But the key thing we care about is TMD is the treatment status of your own sub-district. Okay, so beta T would be your typical ITT estimate. But then the N here is the fraction of your neighbors who are exposed to the treatment, and the beta N is estimating the neighborhood effect, okay? And then the rest are just controls. So the key point here is that if you estimated this without spillovers, then you could be biased if there are spillovers, but adding the spillover term is going to make some of your estimates noisier because you're estimating an additional parameter, okay? And so this is a much more general problem in experimental design. And the econometric issues are exactly the same as you have with interactions. Okay, so people, and I have this paper on factorial designs, and we see exactly the same issue, that people will often run these factorial experiments. They will test for interactions. And if the interaction is not significant, then they will ignore it and present the main effects. Okay, the problem is that's model-based, that's database model selection, right? And so that has a bunch of, that just doesn't work econometrically, right? So the only thing you can do in these settings where you think a priori there may be spillovers or maybe interactions, but you're not sure, is you just need to transparently report both the fully saturated specification, and kind of saying, listen, because these look like second order and adding noise, I'm going to also show you these without the interactions. Okay, so what we're going to show you is we're going to show you this fully specified kind of version in every table, except when we're testing for heterogeneity, because then you're adding even more interactions, okay? But basically what you'll see is that the ITTs are all in the appendix, and the ITTs and the main treatment effects lined up all the time. But even when the spillovers are not significant, that directionally, they're always going the same direction as the main effects, okay? So we're going to focus on this adjusted treatment effect, which is the beta T, which is the one of you getting treated, plus your average neighborhood exposure, which is about 36%, times the estimated spillover parameter, okay? So that's how we're going to present these results. So to give you a sense of how these spillovers are constructed, so here's kind of a hypothetical junction of 4 mandals or sub-districts, right? The dark blues are treated, the light blues are controlled. So if you look at village A, what we do is we exclude the villages in your own mandal, okay? Because that's kind of included in your own treatment effect, and also because there's no reason to assume constant effects at distance from the border. So to keep what we want to do is we want to keep this neighborhood measure completely independent of your own treatment status, okay? So for that, we basically look at the fraction of your treated neighbors excluding your own mandal, okay? So if you look at village A, in this radius, you will get a neighborhood exposure of 2/5, right? Because I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 2 of these guys are treated. Conversely, if I look at village B, the neighborhood exposure is going to be 4/5, right? Because when I look at outside my own mandal, but inside the circle, I've got 4 dark blues and 1 light blue. Okay, so that's how this is constructed. So let's get to the results. So the first is this income data from our survey, right? So you get this 9,600 rupee increase in annual income, which is about 14% on this control mean. The NREGA income is only about 14% of that. And so here you see the cost, right? So in the main effects, it is significant, but once you add this neighborhood effect, it just becomes noisier. Okay, so in some cases, it's giving you noise without giving you kind of much benefits, but you have to just do this consistently. But I think the big result is here on the wages. So you see how the wage labor income accounts for a substantial part of this total income increase, okay? And this is the distribution. The treatment distribution completely first order stochastically dominates. Okay, so everybody's better off. And this is how we calculate this 25% reduction in poverty. So now let's get to wages. And you see that there's this big increase in market wages. Look at column 2, right? So there's 13 rupees on a control mean of about 128. So that's a little over 10%. And so here you see that both the main effect and the spillover effects are significant and going in the same direction. The reservation wage also goes up. But here there's no spillover, and that's exactly what we would expect, because NREGA by law can only be done in your own village, okay? So if your village is treated and we don't find any spillovers in implementation in the prior paper, right? So the reservation wage responds to your outside option, okay? And my outside option is affected by whether I have better NREGA in my village, okay? Not what's happening in the other village. But the market wage, what we see is that there's a substantial amount of spatial market integration in rural labor markets. So Supreet, for example, would say it's about 20, 25 kilometers. And that's almost how we came up with our 20-kilometer default radius, but we show the robustness to other radiuses, but radii. But basically the point is that the market wage, the way the market wage works is you often have these village spot markets where intermediaries who say, I need to hire 100 workers for this construction project will show up. And then people from the surrounding villages will usually come to that point, right? Where the daily wage or short-term labor contracts happen. And so now you can see that if I'm in one of these market settings, but I have more treated villages around me, then the reservation wage of more people has gone up. And so then my market wage has to respond even more when I have more treated people in that vicinity. Okay, and so that's kind of exactly what we're seeing, that there's no spillover in the reservation wage, but that there is a spillover in the market wages. Okay. And it's also, like I said, the results then allow us to infer something about market structure and the extent of spatial market integration. And then the big result on employment So unsurprisingly, you get this positive effect on NREGA, right? But you also get this positive effect on days worked in the private sector. And again, the main effect and the spillovers are in the same direction. And the net effect is quite substantial. And then here you see kind of one of the problems with the existing ways the NSS measures it, right? Because they measure, they combine self-employment and private employment. So when we measure self-employment are not working, you see the significant reduction over here, okay? So now one of the limitations, like I said, is the wage and employment data are from June, okay? And we don't have the same rich data for pass through to the rest of the year, okay? But we do have one data point per village because we had a survey of kind of village leader or village elder where we just asked what is the going rate for casual labor in the village in each month of the year. And so that's obviously much noisier, but you see that the treatment distribution is consistently higher, suggesting that there is some nominal wage rigidity. So it's highest in that peak period, as you can see, as you would expect when NREGA is the strongest, but that seems to persist throughout the year. So it's consistent with Supreet's work on just behavioral nominal wage rigidity, but also consistent with a much older tradition of kind of labor tying in rural labor markets over the agricultural labor cycle, right? So the old idea here is that in the lean season, employers, the landlords provide you insurance, right, through credit or loans, but they take it back in the peak season by paying you much lower wages, or effectively they will subtract the interest, right? And so a lot of the default bonded labor and a lot of the default kind of labor tying that Pranav wrote about, like in his classic 1983 QJE paper, right, comes from the fact of this linkage over time. And so when you come in and break that linkage, whereby in the lean season, you're not as dependent on the landlord, you can also see why it's consistent with the wages them being higher throughout the year. Okay, now of course that's not direct evidence. We're just saying this is consistent with that story and consistent with, again, why landlords would resist a program like this so much. Okay. So there's no effects on inflation and prices. Okay, so these are real effects, but you do see these negative effects on land returns, like I talked about. So so that's just what I mentioned up front. So now let's go to the census. Okay, so in the census, what you see in the SECC data is that this is very, very coarse data. It's got 3 categories of households below 5,000, between 5 and 10, and above 10,000. And if you first look at the ITTs that are a little more precise, you see the significant reduction here in this main effect, right, which is minus 3%. And you see that that mass is shifting into this middle income, okay? And those effects continue to be significant, though slightly noisier in the adjusted treatment effects, okay? And that's kind of telling you that there is this rightward shift in the income distribution. And then this is in the employment census, in the economic census, where you see the significant increase in the number of non-agricultural employees and the number of non-agricultural enterprises. Okay, so again, basically, obviously the census and the survey data don't completely map to each other, but the 2 most important outcomes are income and employment, and you see them both validated in these independent census data sets. Okay, so I'll come back to the firm size distribution later. Okay, and then here's the distributional analysis. So, so we do this in 2 ways, right? So there's an SECC crosswalk that we can do, and I won't spend too much time. The bottom line is it shows that in the SECC data, most of the benefits of poverty reduction are going to those registered for NREGA. Okay, so even though the aggregate effect is positive, the bulk of this is in the beneficiary sample. So the point is that even though the survey data covers only 50% of the population, it does cover the population where the gains seem to be concentrated, and the average effect on the non-job card holders seems to be about 0. Okay, that's the average in the top 50% if you assume that there's kind of an ordinal ranking of households by SES and job card holding. Okay, but now we can do better. We can do better because we have the SECC data where we have this entire census. So we can take the returns to labor went up, right? So we can look at the gains in labor. So let me just show you the picture. Okay, so what is this panel A doing? The panel A, so they're all sorting the households by land holdings. Okay, so you can see the majority, over 50%, own 0 acres because this is just their homestead. But then among those who but sorry, no, sorry, this is the land holding. Yeah, so the bins are land holding, but the first one is wages. Okay, so this is just taking the estimated wage treatment effect and multiplying it by the number of working age adults in the household to then impute what is the increase to labor factor endowment, right, based on the household composition. And then you can do the same thing for profits and calculate what would be the profit reduction. Okay, so here the estimates there's from the survey. And we use the price estimate of 6% rather than the 19% because we think that almost surely is not including the imputed value of your own labor cost. And we can talk more about that. But then we also have a model-based estimate, which is even more conservative. Okay, so the model-based estimate actually shows that the reduction in profits is more like 2.5%. The survey-based estimate is about 6%. And then you multiply that from the cost of cultivation survey. The NSS puts out kind of the average profits and so one thing to highlight is these are still conservative estimates of, aggressive estimates of profit loss. The likely profit loss is almost certainly less than this because we're not accounting for possible factor reoptimization. And also, if you believe Foster-Rosenzweig, a lot of the existing NSS profit data is actually overstated because it's not properly accounting for the imputed cost of family labor. But leaving that aside, the amount that we take is from official data sets, and that still gives you, right, I mean that when you add these two guys up, that essentially the net effects are positive for the bottom 92.5%. And it's really only these large landholders, if you assume the larger profit reduction, that you kind of see that they're worse off. Okay, so everybody's, for the most part, the bottom 90% of the population is better off. And then if you do this by SES, you kind of get a very similar result. And now, so again, higher SES households will have more land. Okay, so obviously you're going to see more profit reduction for them. But because land is not the only marker of SES, right, that negative effect is slightly attenuated. So now when I add the two, even at the 99th percentile, you see that the net effect is about 0, but not negative. Okay, so it just tells you how broad-based the positive impacts are, but clearly with concentrated losses among large landholders. How am I on time? Do I have 10?
Yeah, you have 10.
10.
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do this. I feel confident. This is good. Okay. So, all right, so let's talk labor productivity, okay? And so what we have in this Cobb-Douglas is, essentially the amount of capital stock increase you would need to explain these results is about 60%. And what we see is that all NREGA capital formation was only about 4.4% of total rural capital stock, okay? So even if this 30% increase in NREGA days work we find led to a proportional increase in assets, that would imply an increase in capital stock of only 1.3%, which would account for only about 2.5% of this total increase needed to explain the effects. Okay, there's no significant effects on nutritional outcomes or skill acquisition, and you see there's no effects on land use, area irrigated. So all of this is kind of not consistent with a direct productivity story. Okay, so there might be indirect labor demand effects, but it doesn't seem to be a direct kind of story of, hey, I created more productive rural assets or people became more productive. Okay, and then let's go to employee market power. Okay, so we see that the reservation wages went up significantly, and villages with larger land concentration, you get these effects. Okay, so here is now the Herfindahl index, and this is done both with the full sample and also restricted to land holdings above 1 acre because the super small guys are less likely to be employers. And basically you see that the treatment, that the raw correlation, now this is just cross-sectional, okay, so not causal at all, but the cross-section is consistent with kind of lower employment in areas of higher concentration. Okay, so that's what this negative coefficient is. And so this is the raw Herfindahl, this is standardized, so this guy can be interpreted as 1 standard deviation, okay? And then if you interact the treatment with this measure of land concentration, it is significantly positive. And in standard deviation terms, this is basically saying that for 1 standard deviation increase in land concentration, you kind of got an extra 0.5 days of private employment in the treated areas. Okay, so again, obviously, this is an interaction test, so it's not like a direct test, but it's kind of consistent with employer market power because the sharp test is what happens to employment, right? If it's perfectly competitive labor markets, I mean, then you should expect that this should be negative. Okay, and then, so, we've been looking into this monopsony literature quite a bit, and basically this employer concentration is a proxy for market power, but it doesn't always neatly map into what is the precise marker of monopsony, right? Because the precise marker of employer market power is what is the markdown of your wages relative to marginal product. Okay, so that is given by this ratio given by the labor supply elasticity. And this is where having the reservation wage data really, really helps, right? Because without that, you cannot pin down the elasticity because you only observe one wage in employment. Like, you can't pin down a labor supply shift. But essentially what we show in the model is that you can back out this elasticity using these two parameters, which is the partial and the reservation wage from the change in theta, which is the extent of improvement in NREGA as an outside option. And you divide that by the change in the actual market wage. Okay, so here is another suggestive test suggest that you had employer market power, right? Because basically in competitive markets, what should happen is if the reservation wage goes up, the market wage should go up by less than the reservation wage, right? Because there's some adjustment on the quantity margin. But if you have market power, then what's going to happen is if the employment goes up, right? Because remember, labor supply curves slope upwards, okay? So if the employment has positive, it must mean that the market wage has gone up by more than the reservation wage, okay? And that's exactly what we see. The reservation wage went up by about 7 rupees and the market wage went up by about 13. Okay, so that's another indirect piece of evidence which is consistent with the increase in labor supply, because labor supply curves are upward sloping. Okay, and so basically what we get from these two moments in the data is we can estimate a wage markdown of about 25%. Now, one caveat, right? This is a market level markdown, not employer level markdown, okay? Because we don't observe employer level data. But there's a recent global review on monopsony, and they estimate kind of a markdown range of somewhere between 70 and 90%. And so we're at the higher end of the markdowns, the higher end of employer market power, but we're kind of in that range, okay? So then coming to aggregate demand, so there's several pieces of evidence, right, that point to an increase in aggregate demand. So like I said, our survey doesn't measure consumption really well. And so this is an interesting teaching moment, right? So where absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So we ourselves thought that, okay, maybe demand is not a big part of the story. But if you then go back and look at the confidence intervals in our consumption data, you cannot rule out marginal propensities of consuming of anything between 0 and 1, right? So the consumption data is almost meaningless in inferring demand. But what we realize is that the saving data is much more precisely measured, okay? People can report their savings more precisely than every line item of consumption that they had in the past month, okay? And what you see is that the savings increased by only 3% of the estimated income gains, and that is much more precise. So that 95% confidence interval is about like -3% to +9%, okay? And so what that tells you is at least 90% of this income gain like showed up back either in consumption or in asset purchases. So it doesn't matter whether they buy this for production or consumption. What matters is this is not going into a financial system and being intermediated somewhere else, right? Because this is going to contribute to local demand. We see this increase in asset holdings. We see a substantial increase in borrowing, suggesting like some credit is crowded in, from this higher income. But a lot of this is informal borrowing. And you see this increase in livestock shifting, from cattle to buffaloes that are higher return and more expensive. The new firm creation is concentrated among single employee firms, which is consistent with being small. And then about half of this increase in labor income is coming from non-agricultural labor, okay? So again, we do not observe the split in demand across sectors, okay? So obviously, the way to think about this is improved NREGS is an impulse that's affecting the economy. And then we have this question of how the feedback is all working. So we don't see how exactly the feedback works to ag and non-ag, but there's many pieces of suggestive evidence in our data that, Engel curves for food are obviously income elasticities are very low. There's falling farm profits, increase in non-ag firm count and employment. So all of that suggests that the demand was being kind of channeled to the non-ag sector. Okay, so here's then these results. You see this is increase in in asset ownership. The savings goes up by only 3% and it's non-significant. The firm size and firm counts. So now if I look at the number of firms, you'll see that almost the significant gains are all happening in single employee firms. Okay, so this is now also consistent with Paul's work in Kenya, where they have these aggregate demand multipliers of 2.4. And a lot of this seems to really benefit like the small guys who are demand constrained. Okay, so this is very consistent with that. And in the number of employees, you see it's kind of positive everywhere, but again, it's significant here and then for the very large ones. Okay. So this is then the income breakdown. So remember the table where I showed you in the survey data that the wages went up by about 7,500 plus. So that split is almost half and half between agricultural labor income, which would be kind of more that monopsony piece, because remember we're measuring land concentration. And then there's this non-agricultural labor income, right? Which is then consistent with the fact that the firms in our data are likely to employ people, and some of those people are going to be in our survey data, okay? So how do you interpret this? So obviously on the firm side, there are offsetting effects, right? So there's benefits of increased demand, but that could be offset by cost of higher wages. But our results suggest that this net effect was clearly positive. And this is consistent with growing non-experimental evidence that the economic benefits of a coordinated increase in wages through boosting demand may outweigh the costs of higher wages. Okay, so this is, we've got Jeremy Magruder's paper in Indonesia, Kyle Emmerich, Gabby Santangelo in India. So, and this is consistent with this very old idea in development economics about the possibility of a big push, right, whereby a coordinated increase in wages can accelerate a structural transformation through aggregate demand externalities, right? So these are almost like the classic models of poverty traps, and it's consistent with that. So I think the overall evidence, and I'm basically done, is consistent with this narrative, right? Mean that the NREGA improved. It improved its quality as an outside option. I mean, work on NREGA did go up, of course, but that seems to be in second order to the increase in reservation wages. And again, magnitude-wise, this is, I didn't say this, it's consistent with the fact that if you just look at the control group, only 7% of income is coming from NREGA, right? So even if NREGA were to double, right, I mean, that couldn't explain the sheer scale of the effects, okay? So this seems to have pushed up the reservation wages, which has then kind of been passed through to increases in market wages. And that, the most important kind of reversal of conventional wisdom is that seems to have kind of actually increased employment because this is happening in the context of employer market power. And so then you have this two engines firing on income, right? Though the wages and employment are augmenting as opposed to attenuating. And then you get that big increase in income, which is also increasing local demand. And that seems to then show up in the number of non-farm firms and employment, okay? So to wrap up, what are these policy implications? I mean, they contribute directly to the global and national debates on these employment guarantee programs. We find that they can increase wages and employment, especially in settings of employer market power, that the market level GE effects are potentially much, much more important than the direct effects of the program, and that a program like this can improve both equity and efficiency, okay? And now I think when you think about external validity, how do we think about this in other settings? I think it's useful to focus more on principles rather than point estimates. And I think this is the paper where I have probably reversed my priors the most relative to any paper I've worked on, right? I mean, that's happened in other papers too. But in fact, I remember, Robin, I don't know if you remember, like, in 2012, when I was first presenting smart cards, right, at LSE, I think IGC, I even said that the smart cards may have been a tactical win on a strategic mistake, okay, which is that if NREGA itself was going to hinder kind of migration or structural transformation, or in fact increase factor misallocation because you're increasing wages without increasing productivity, that you may have implemented NREGA better, but it may make the overall economy worse. I don't know if you have a recording, Rob, but I said that I think in around 2012 or 2013. So we, and this is not ideology, right? This is just Econ 101, right? You just think about if you boost wages without productivity, this would likely reduce private employment and attenuate the anti-poverty effects. And I think this just highlights the value of experimentation, because the experiment meant that we had to take the results seriously. So I remember, in fact, talking to Attila Lindner at UCL, and he once mentioned that he saw some data in Hungary in the context of and similar program where he was finding some positive effects on employment, and he was just like, it can't be true. It must be some identification problem. Okay, so he didn't even bother looking at it. But here, because the experiment meant that the results were correct, okay? So then we just had to keep on making sense of it. And because, the survey data didn't have a census, we've spent like years looking for other data sets, and we've confirmed this now in multiple independent censuses. And so, it highlights the value of experimentation, right? Just as a way of sometimes forcing you to confront your priors and then go back and look at, what may have changed. So I think when you take this to other settings, the main point I have to say about external validity is, we've had some conversations advising the government of South Africa on this, is that what we've seen is that governments often consider public employment programs as a response to high unemployment, right? So that's when you're thinking about this. And so these are more generally likely to be settings where employers have more market power than workers, okay? And so our findings may be more broadly relevant to such settings, all right? And the results, like I said, also highlight the large returns of improving state capacity for implementation. Because again, remember, we didn't roll out the program. All that we did here was study the effects of improving implementation quality, and you see these huge effects. So it just reiterates the importance of that as a first order topic by itself. So thank you, and let me stop.
Thanks, Karthik, so much. I'm just going to offer the floor to Katsushi directly. So Katsushi, please ask your question away.
Should I stop the slide share?
Nope, just leave it. I mean, you can leave them there.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you very much. It's an extremely interesting paper. So I have two questions. First is that what appears to be missing is that the effect through the change in the agricultural wage and agricultural employment. So have the same story with the evidence. So on that route, and related to that, so you showed one of the econometric result table where you show some negative effect on self-employment and positive effect on market employment. So if I take the results, the face value, so that negative effect and positive effect appear to be offsetting. So how would you interpret that particular table, and how would you consider the effect on, say, the effect on agriculture or employment in that picture? Thank you.
Yeah, so excellent question. So on the agricultural employment, so unfortunately, we don't break down the employment by sector, right? I mean, so, what we have is NREGA work, private paid work, and self-employment, right? So that private paid work, we didn't separate into agricultural jobs and non-agricultural jobs, right? What we do have is in the wage income, which is kind of the overall annual income, there we do ask, because again, remember, because we're asking the employment in this narrow kind of 1 month window, right? And so that breakdown, seemed to matter more like in an overall annual summary. So there, if you look at the increases in wage income, it's about half and half in ag and non-ag. Okay. So then coming to your second question about this, this offsetting effect. So that's exactly right? So mechanically, there's a fixed amount of time, right? So if I have 30 days in a month, the days that I spend increased working, has to come from a reduction in either unemployment or, very few people call themselves unemployed, right? I mean, they will typically say that they're self-employed. But what we know is that from so many studies is that self-employment in the lean season tends to be very low marginal product, right? Because there just isn't much paid work. And so people are just doing what little self-employment they can. So it is almost certainly the case that the total marginal product and the income that is coming from the increase in private employment is substantially greater than any foregone income from the reduction in self-employment, right? So that's how you should make sense of that story.
Thank you.
Excellent. So Hyodip, you are allowed to talk now. Jyoti Kiran Shukla, that's you should be allowed to talk.
Yeah, this is Jyoti Kiran Shukla. My mic was not getting,
Perfect. Now it's perfect. It's very clean.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent paper on NREGA, because it's been an extremely important program of the government of India. And working with the government, I understand the importance of it even better, working as the chairperson of the Finance Commission, Rajasthan. Karthik, still I have a question. This entire paper, whatever I've understood, is having no gender analysis whatsoever. Was there any gender analysis, like, women versus men? Who gained what was the dynamics of gain, and whether the village dynamics change at the end? Because it is a program which was later done at the panchayat level, which you are, I think.
Fantastic questions. I think so on the
genders.
Thank you
very much.
So great questions. I think, so the gender split, I'm pretty sure we have it in appendix. I think part of the problem is this paper has already become so long, right? It's about over 100 pages now with 10 appendices with every possible additional cut. So I think the gender piece, we definitely looked at it, but it didn't look like prima facie that there was any significant difference. But I think you're right that the point estimates for women were higher, right? I mean, in terms of some of the wage effects, which is consistent with the fact that NREGA mattered more for women, right? Because legally the NREGA wage was kind of the same regardless of gender, but the market wage for men is higher, right? I mean, so the intra-household impact of this on NREGA is higher. But I think there is other work showing that there could have been some negative effects of this as well, because I think Manisha Shah has a paper showing that because women now are more likely to go work on NREGA, the elder daughters are now more likely to get pulled into childcare of the younger children. And they were finding some negative effects on education in that group. So I think, it's the gender story is absolutely critical, but, there are other papers that are looking explicitly at the gender question. So I think for us, we had more of one table cutting it that way. And then I think the downstream effects on panchayat governance, all of this, I mean, these are all fantastic questions. In fact, we had an RA once who considered even doing a political economy study of looking at the downstream effects in municipal elections of the smart cards. Now, of course, that would have been of the smart card program, not of NREGA per se. And I think the truth is that we didn't anticipate these big effects, right? I mean, so we didn't go and collect those data sets. So where we've been lucky is that we have these 2 or 3 censuses In fact, going back to Katsushi, we also wanted to find the agricultural census, right? And so it would have been fantastic if the agri census had worked out for us, but that was done in 2010 and 2015. And so that doesn't work for the experiment because the experiment was 2010 to 2012, right? But SCCC worked for us because that was 2011-12. Economic census worked for us because that was 12 and 13. Livestock census worked because, again, that was 12 and 13, but ag census did not work, okay? So yeah, so again, the moral of the story here is why governments should invest in high quality administrative data, because that helps researchers. You can't collect every piece of data in your experiment.
I would add, it doesn't only help researchers. Basically, the researchers are for policy understanding and implementation. So
Exactly.
I think the logic is even
stronger,
more integrated.
Exactly.
Stronger.
Exactly.
Thank you very
Absolutely.
much. It is an excellent paper. We'll be in touch. I need to share some experiments that we've done in the state of Rajasthan, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
Sounds great. So I think we have Karen who wants to ask a question. Yeah, Karen, I think you can speak directly, so I don't need to do anything.
So this is a somewhat bigger picture question. So you refer to Pranav's work in kind of the paper, I guess, is 83, and then 2011. I would have thought the economy was more diversified than it was in 83. And so do you want us to really think of the monopsony to be only in agriculture, or is it just that that's where you can observe it somehow, and is this or is this really an agricultural story?
No, fantastic question, right? So, and in fact, yeah, we have this in a footnote of the section when we talk about the channels in, because yes, the monopsony story could also be applying to the non-ag market, right? So you're absolutely right that we can only quantify it in the case of the ag because we have the land holding data, right? Now, because if you look at the firm data and try to calculate based on that, the problem is that is a post-treatment outcome, right? Means so you can't use that to calculate concentration. And even with the SCCC, this is a potential concern, right? Because it's conducted after the experiment, but land holdings move much, much more slowly. And we confirmed that there's no change in the landholding concentration. So that's kind of there before we even present those results, right? But you're right. In principle, there is no reason to believe that this is only agriculture. It could also be, and again, we don't have to think about this old monopsony story of kind of, the one employer town where you have the coal, the coal mine or the steel mill, steel plant, that one employer controls everything, right? I think what the modern work of Alan Manning and others will just show you is that just any frictions, right? I mean, in job search can give you a certain amount of employer market power. So it doesn't have to be this one big bad employer. The frictions are enough to give you that wedge between wage and marginal product. And so there's no reason for that not to apply, even in the case of the private market. But we think that the concentration story there is just less likely given how the majority of these firms are just like single employee, right? They're just very, very, very small. Yeah, so that's absolutely right. And I think, which is why even when I connect back to Pranav, I think, part of this is almost just a little kind of development, intellectual history and nostalgia, right? Like it means saying that we've had these classic papers of Big Push and structural transformation and labor tying, and kind of the empirical labor literature kind of really died in the mid 90s, right? I mean, so there are these handbook chapters that Jerry Berman and Mark Rosenzweig were writing in the late 80s. And then, I think it's only after then there was this big gap, right? And then, there was Seema's paper and now Supreet's work and now more work happening with labor market experiments, which is great. But, I just think this is massively understudied relative to how important it is.
So let me ask away a question, but everyone should feel free to raise their hands. I can't see anyone wanted to ask a question, so I'm just going to ask either way. So, Karthik, can you push a little bit the argument on much monopsony power you need in order to get some of the findings? So by that I mean, right now you're basing it, I think, out of the average monopsony power, but in a way you can actually go through the schedule of that because you have different markets where you're operating. And so you could actually, in the model, you can actually bring that in and you can say, well, look, the external validity really hinges upon this type of extent of monopsony power. Mm-hmm. And that would be quite useful, I think, for informing other situations, because I think you need a substantial amount of monopsony power. Otherwise, you're not going to get the positive effects everywhere. But you can actually maybe pinpoint how much you need.
No, that's a great point. Like, so, and again, see, obviously, we have no idea what the functional form is, right, between the concentration and kind of these effects, right? So maybe there's a threshold model, maybe. So basically what we have in the test is just a simple linear interaction, right? And then to quantify, what we show is that, and I skipped through that, right? So just like we quantified based on the model saying that the capital stock story can explain at most 2.5% of the total effects, here what we find is that in fact, we're almost sure we're underestimating market concentration, right? Because we are measuring this at the parcel of individual land holdings. But again, if you just look at all the descriptive work on rural labor markets, I mean, there's a lot of caste-based kind of collusion, right? I mean, so that's what Shivan and Ashok's AER paper is all about, right? I mean, that how the elite landowning castes collude in terms of weight setting, right? So in that, and unfortunately, SECC doesn't release the microcast data. It doesn't release the JAT data that you would need to do that, right? So I think our measure of concentration is almost certainly a lower bound, right? I mean, with regard to the Herfindahl, okay? Which is why we then go to the direct test of measuring the markdown and saying, can you infer from the data, right, a parsimonious summary statistic for what the markdown is. And the markdown is given by those elasticities. And so then we go and estimate the elasticity. The elasticity is noisily estimated, right? I mean, because it's got there's a denominator there that kind of blows up a little bit. So, but that's how we've tried to push this in terms of the quantification. Now, I don't know if what you're suggesting is kind of look at a matched approach where I say, let's compare control and treatment villages with comparable concentration and then trace out this non-parametrically to kind of get a sense of where the effect shows up. Is that what you had in mind?
I had in mind you could actually do that, and you could also do it within the model as well. Because the model is basically disciplining the way that the monopsony, so the markdown that it's basically what type of elasticity do you need in order to
I see. No. So, but here's the problem, right?
And then you can estimate in the data.
Yeah. So here's the problem. The problem is the Herfindahl measure is a different measure from the markdown, right? So the Herfindahl measure is just something that we're showing as an existence result, right? Means saying that this is consistent with monopsony. Then for the quantification, we're going to the model that requires the elasticity, but the elasticity is not estimated separately for each village. The elasticity is estimated in the whole sample, right? Yeah. So that's why that crosswalk doesn't quite work, but we can talk more about how to do that.
I mean, you can do it across markets, but so Raji has a question, so I'm going to allow him to talk. You should just be able to unmute yourself, Raji.
Great. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes. Perfect.
Karthik, thank you. I really, really enjoyed the paper. Two questions that are sort of unrelated. One is, I wonder if you can say anything about the extent to which interlinked contracts give employers bargaining power with particular employees, and this would involve, market power, but not in the sense of market power within villages, but at the individual level with employers vis-a-vis employees. That's the first question, interlinked contracts. And the second unrelated question has to do with just going back to the gender question that we raised. This is probably a tired question because everyone wants to know some gender dimension of labor markets, but in the Indian context, because female labor force participation is so low, I was wondering if you can say something to, the extent to which it's demand or supply, in the sense that your story speaks a lot about sort of the demand side constraints that are relaxed thanks to NREGA, but there are also social norms and supply side constraints. So I was wondering if you can say something to the balance there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, these are both incredibly important questions. And, my honest answer is I have very little to say about those two things in the paper because, like I said, the whole experiment was designed to study corruption, right? I mean, it was designed to study corruption and leakage and payment processes, right? So if you look at what we were focusing on, we were sampling from the universe of kind of work spells. And then the core question we were after was, when you roll out the smart cards, how does this improve NREGA implementation? And so the measurement was then focused on matched data between administrative records of dispersal and households recorded receipts, and then tracking that, right? Now, of course, we were cognizant of the fact that if you're improving NREGA, it may have all of these other effects. And so that's why we have income data. We have a bunch of things. But I think given the finite survey constraints, right, I mean, we just had literally no bandwidth, or even, that was not what this project was designed for, right? So I think the questions are incredibly important. And like I was kind of telling Karen, I just think these issues of labor markets, of how things are changing with development, with migration, with seasonal migration, with spot migration, I just think we just don't understand a lot of these issues well enough. And I just want to see a lot more research.
That's excellent. So a lot of line of research going forward, Karthik. So let me thank Karthik and everyone else for being here today. We are a little, like a couple of minutes late maybe, but we totally enjoyed it. So thanks so much. Karthik has shared the Zoom room. So you should be able to see the address and everything. It's password protected, but the password is there. So it's not very protected anymore, I guess. So you might want to change it afterwards. But anyway, so you're gonna be there immediately, right, Karthik? So
yeah, I'll be there in 1 minute. Yeah, I'll
just give Karthik 1 minute to,
and
that's excellent. So thank you so much. And well, I guess we'll see a lot of the participants in a couple of weeks. I think Mark Rosenzweig is giving the next VDEV CEPR BREAD. So looking forward to see you all there. And again, thanks, Karthik, so much. Fantastic talk.
Thank you. I'll see you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So are you coming to the room, Giacomo? Are you coming?
I might come actually very quickly, but I need to say something else.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Ciao.
Bye-bye.